And I went to Liberty because I knew that they had a conversion therapy program. And I didn't at the time conceptualize it as a conversion therapy program. Instead, I thought of it as, there was a pastor at Liberty who I knew of who worked with guys like me. And, through pastoral counseling, he would be able to lead me on the straight and narrow, pun completely intended. And I could eventually find, a wife, any wife will do, and then, marry her and then off to Canada, go again and live that godly, normal sort of, heteronormative Christian life. The court case itself, I just think it's absolutely bonkers. Not only in the actual premise of it, right? Like the fact that we're still talking about this, in 2025, but on top of that, thinking about the argument that is, being put forth that this is a matter of free speech. What a wild and ludicrous, way of going about this case.
Hello, I am so excited to be here today with Dr. Luke Wilson. He is the SSHRC Postdoctoral Fellow at the University of Toronto Mississauga. And really kind of where I kind of fell in love with the work that you're doing, Luke, is through your Instagram account. You're doing some really, really important work out there for the queer community. And I got your book, Shame, Sex, Attraction, which you've edited, and there's an article that you wrote in that we'll talk a little bit more about that. You've also been published at The Advocate, Queerty, LGBTQ Nation, and a few other places, and I know you're working on other stuff, so we'll talk about that as we get going. But yeah, I'm just really excited to have this conversation with you today.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, so this book was really, really powerful. Again, I'll hold it up. If folks haven't gotten it yet, I really recommend that people pick this up. The first question for you is, what drew you to this topic, and how come this was something you wanted to do some more work around?
Yeah, so I originally, I should say before I jump into the thick of the answer that most of my past work was actually in Holocaust studies. And so I looked at what led to the Holocaust, and then I looked at what happened after the Holocaust, not so much what happened during. And most of my research really was looking at the antecedents of the Holocaust, so looking at the intergenerational transmission of trauma between survivors, their kids, and their grandkids. And as I was developing my research profile and trying to, put myself out there and apply for, grants or awards or jobs, I really quickly realized that it was not street cred within the academic community to have gone to Liberty University, which is the world's largest evangelical university, which is where I regrettably did my undergrad. And I decided that I needed to separate myself as much as possible from Liberty. And so I thought, you know what, I'm going to write a public facing article, not an academic article, but, something that I can publish in, more popular press or by a popular press and again, differentiate myself from the typical Liberty alumnus and just, again, make it clear that I'm not sort of, one of them. And so I wrote this article, and it was eventually published in Queerty, and it was about my experience at Liberty, more specifically about my time in conversion therapy. And so that article, not that it took off in the sense of like, I became famous because I'm, nowhere close to this day. However, there was a response that I got from a number of alumni, and I got a response from even current students there and other folks, who knew about Liberty. And so that article just sort of snowballed into another article where I wrote about my experience, not just in the one-on-one conversion therapy program, but in the group therapy program. And then it just sort of snowballed into, different speaking engagements and other writings. And so initially I wasn't even writing about Liberty. I was really just, again, trying to separate myself because I was in, Holocaust studies, a field of research that is highly suspicious of conservative Christian traditions. And so that was really why I started. But eventually it was just that there was some sort of an audience for this. And, unfortunately there is, right? Unfortunately, there is an audience for folks who have undergone conversion therapy, for those who went to Liberty University or come from high control Christian contexts. And so that's really how I started. And then what led to the book was there was an editor who reached out to me on Twitter one day saying, we've been following your work and we're interested in you potentially putting together a collection. Would this be something you'd want to do? And when I got the message, it was on Twitter, right? So I was like, this is a scam. Like, this isn't real. Like, they're going to get me and make me pay the thousands of dollars. And I was like, okay, let me put this editor and this press up. And sure enough, both the editor and the press were legitimate. And so, I jumped on the opportunity, and we sort of negotiated what we wanted the collection to look like. And really, my only stipulation was that I wanted only to include survivors, not folks who had, written about conversion practices imaginatively and as fiction. I instead wanted, the book only to have, survivors' voices, and that's how the book came about. And sure enough, there were, 17 stories, mine included, about experiences in conversion therapy written by survivors, plus a foreword by Garrett Conley, the author of Boy Erased. And that's how the collection came together, and it came out, January 2025, and I've been super excited for it to be out in the world and for it to be in hands like yours.
Yes, yeah, like mine too. Yeah, I think we went through the same publisher, Jessica Kingsley Publishing.
Yeah, great place.
Yeah, I mean, so obviously you're up in Canada, but I'm sure that you have your finger on the pulse of the conversion therapy conversation that's happening down here in the United States. And for those of people who are not familiar, it does seem like the Supreme Court is probably going to take up a case about conversion therapy and really pit it against free speech. I'm wondering for you personally as a survivor, but also the people that you have collected stories from, how is this impacting you personally to hear that this is once again a topic that is going through the legislature?
Yeah. So most of my research at this point, again, I used to, work in Holocaust studies, but I've since pivoted, and shame-sex attraction is not obviously an academic study, but a literary exploration or explorations of conversion therapy representations. But most of my other work really is on conversion practices, and it actually is specifically in the US, a little bit in Canada, but mostly in the US. And so following this Supreme Court case has been a wild ride, and something that has been both, personally affecting, or has affected me personally, and also, professionally. This is something that I have started writing about and will continue to write about. And so the court case itself, I mean, I just think it's absolutely bonkers. I mean, not only in the actual premise of it, right? Like the fact that we're still talking about this, in 2025, but on top of that, thinking about the argument that is, being put forth that this is a matter of free speech. I mean, what a wild and ludicrous, sort of way of going about this case. I mean, if you think about literally every profession, if we're talking about engineers, if we're talking about medical doctors, if we're talking about counselors, whomever, right? Whatever profession you are in, there is a code of conduct that you have to follow. And of course, your free speech is superseded by this code of conduct when you are on the clock, right? Like, as it should be. Like, if you're a medical doctor and you have an opinion about, I don't know, literally anything, and a patient comes in and says, says something, and it's more so a matter of, personal taste or religious belief or whatever, you as a medical doctor can't just go out and spout your beliefs and talk about, well, I think actually, you should be doing X, Y, and Z. Again, you have a code of conduct you have to follow. And here, when we're talking about counselors, and really what they're saying is in the name of free speech. I think this is, a cover for sincerely held religious beliefs, which, again, the fact that ever someone's religious belief could or should supersede an individual's identity is bonkers to me. And so the whole case, again, from its very premise, but also the way that it's being argued, I think is absolute tomfoolery. And I think that of course, like you said, the Supreme Court case will most likely, the Supreme Court will rule in favor of this conversion therapist. And so there's obviously a lot of work ahead. There's a lot of, that needs to be done still. But again, it's just sort of baffling to me that this is where we are. And again, people always push back and like, you shouldn't be baffled, you shouldn't be surprised. It's like, yeah, no, like this is perhaps a turn of speech or turn of phrase. But it's both baffling, but it isn't baffling. It's both surprising and it isn't surprising in the sense that, again, you sort of think that we're making progress, but of course there's so many, steps backwards as many steps we're making, taking forward. And as a result, I'm just sort of left incredulous, but not incredulous. Again, it's this both and moment, but that's where we are. That's where I am personally when I think about this Supreme Court case.
It is baffling, I think is a great word for it. I'm a therapist in the state, Colorado, where this therapist or counselor is from. And it's really, I think it's going to, probably shift the whole mental health field in some ways that people are not even expecting. Because once you say therapy is free speech, it does open the door to a lot of different arguments that can be raised. Did you, so, and you don't have to share more than you'd like to, but could you share a little bit about what your experience was like going through conversion therapy or some lasting takeaways that have happened personally to you?
Well, Tom, conversion therapy was a lot of fun. No, I'm just kidding. So, yeah, conversion therapy for me, I went through 4 years of it. I mean, to be honest, as a former evangelical, people always say like share as much as you're comfortable with. And I'm like, as a former evangelical, we were trained to share everything. There were no such thing as personal boundaries. So for us, we're like, yeah, we'll tell you it all. So for me, again, I went to Liberty University, the school that was founded by Jerry Falwell. For those who know who Jerry Falwell is, well, he has a reputation. For those who don't know who Jerry Falwell is, count your blessings. But I went to Jerry Falwell School in Lynchburg, Virginia. There's a lot to say about the name Lynchburg, but I'll put a pin in that for now. And I mean, in general, I mean, I didn't even come from a high control Christian background. I came from a family in Toronto where I was raised. That was, I had a dad who was agnostic and I had a mom who was at best sort of haunted by her Baptist demons, but wasn't really that, we weren't a Christian family, that's for sure. We went to church on and off when I was young, stopped going by the time I was about, in about grade 2 or 3. And then from there, like every good Canadian family, we just went to the cottage on the weekends instead and church. So I didn't really have too much of a religious, background until I got into high school. Long story short, I became religious starting in grade 9. And then by the time I was going to make my decision for where I was going to go to university, I decided that I was going to go to Liberty. And in large part, why I went to Liberty was because I was made to believe that I had to be straight or celibate in order to remain within, the fold. And I thought to myself, well, I don't want to be celibate, so I might as well give it the good old college try to become straight. And I went to Liberty because I knew that they had a conversion therapy program. And I didn't at the time conceptualize it as a conversion therapy program. Instead, I thought of it as, there was a pastor at Liberty who I knew of who worked with guys like me. And, through pastoral counseling, he would be able to lead me on the straight and narrow, pun completely intended. And I could eventually find, a wife, any wife will do, and then, marry her and then off to Canada to go again and live that godly, normal, sort of, heteronormative Christian uh, life. That clearly didn't happen. But this was the big sort of plan. So I got to Liberty in 2008. And after a few weeks, I decided that I needed to go meet this counselor. There's more to that story. That's actually a story I'll tell in my next collection that's coming out hopefully next year or the year after. But I'll leave that for now. And I went and I met with this guy named Pastor Dane Emmerich, and he was the in-house conversion therapist. He was a paid staff member, formerly the Dean of Men, who then transitioned into his role in pastoral care, a terrifying, title to have, which is what you do, conversion therapy. And so I met with him over the span of 4 years in his one-on-one program. I went to the group program once, and that's the story that I write about in Shame, Sex, Attraction. And so I only went once to that. Whereas the one-on-one program is again, it was over the span of 4 years on a very regular basis. And so for me, my conversion therapy experience was perhaps in line with what a lot of folks think of when they think of conversion therapy, though we should say, conversion therapy is not, one size fits all. There are, a multiplicity of experiences within conversion therapy, or what, scholars and activists refer to as conversion practices, which perhaps broadens what we're talking about when we're talking about this topic. But my experience was, the quote unquote talk therapy. And of course, it wasn't therapy. And of course, there was no conversion. The term is a misnomer, but it is, the best sort of recognized term that we can use when we're talking about what we're talking about. So for me, we started off, Pastor Dane and I, in a very pseudo-Freudian space where he would ask me a lot of questions about my mom and my dad. What was my relationship like to both of them? What was my relationship like to my siblings? And we were really looking for what was the root cause of, what made me gay. Though, of course, we wouldn't have talked about it in those terms. We would have said, where did my my same-sex attraction come from? And so we eventually decided, he and I, more so he, that my homosexuality or my homosexual tendencies, or whatever you want to call it, whatever he called it, really came from my mom. That she was overbearing, she was too involved in my life, which I mean was true. Cheryl, my mom, was overbearing and far too involved. But the narrative is typically that a young gay boy has an overbearing mother and then an absentee or emotionally distant father. And I didn't have that. My dad was phenomenal. My dad was arguably much more involved in a healthy way in my life. So, but again, conversion therapists aren't necessarily known for consistency or intellectual honesty. But we went with the narrative that it was my mom's fault, which was like very Book of Genesis, chapter 1, right? Like, Eve did it and she did it, blame the woman. So Christianity is not that, yeah, it just repeats the same scripts over and over. So this is the story that we went with. And that was, for the first few meetings, this is really how we went about talking to each other. And so from there, once we had, established, okay, these are the roots of my queerness or my same-sex attraction. We went from there, and it was really just a pattern or routine, series of meetings that we had. And those meetings involved reading scripture, praying together, me reading my manual. My manual was Alan Medinger's Growth into Manhood, Resuming the Journey. Alan Medinger was one of Exodus International's former presidents. And so we read this, over the span of the 4 years that I was there. And we talked about, different things, including, and I mean, a big sort of push, at least within my experience, was behavior modification. So changing how I acted, acting like a man, quote unquote, in order to not just act like a man over time, but instead to become a man, right? So playing sports, doing carpentry, like very Jesus of him, right? Like that's woodwork. He's the least thing. Anywho, this was really, how he went about it. And then again, really talking about the supposed wounds of my childhood, really again relating constantly to my mom. And so that was really, those were the sort of defining features of my time in conversion therapy, in addition to the sort of tactile aspect. And that really included at the beginning and at the end of our meetings, he'd always give me this really, enthusiastic bear hug, which looking back, you're thinking to yourself, like, why was he so tactile? And then on top of that, whenever we prayed, he would always put his hand on my leg. And I was talking with someone about this, after the fact, and he also met with Dane. And he said it was never so far down on your leg that he put his hand that you didn't notice it, but it was also not far enough up that you were like, hey, stop. Even though, of course, evangelicals are trained again to have no personal boundaries and sort of defer to authority. This really was, again, something that you just sort of clocked in the moment and you remembered. And I think about it now. And of course, like I have a pretty clear idea why this man was doing this. But at the time, you really think, and again, in the way that evangelicals think, is that, again, you defer to authority. They're in, a position of power for a reason. You respect and honor your elders. And I just thought it was him sort of modeling like good touch, bad touch in the same way that he did, bear hugs, which of course is like such an infantilizing sort of like exercise, but nonetheless, this is really what I thought of. And he was supposed to be a role model for me, right? So these were the defining features of my time in conversion therapy. And I have, in the past talked about this, and I've had people respond in a number of ways saying like, isn't that awful? And other people who, and I think this is kind of a wild sort of response for anyone. But some people have said, well, that doesn't sound that bad. And you're like, okay, thanks for
Whoa.
experience. But I think that for me, I've thought a lot about that response, and I've thought a lot about, okay, if I'm to take, this claim that it wasn't that bad seriously, what would I say is the violence of conversion therapy? And I do think, and perhaps to their point, even though I think it's again like never an appropriate thing to say to someone, I do think that really for me, the violence of conversion therapy was after the fact, in the sense that I was taught at Liberty that I could find attraction to the opposite, quote unquote, sex or gender. And if I only were to, again, follow this strict, regimented, way of being and, doing X, Y, and Z, again, acting like a man, doing the things that men do, talk about the things that men do. And over time, I would habituate a straight persona, and it wouldn't be a persona, but would instead be just who I am. And that, again, when I did that, when I left Liberty, because when I was at Liberty, I was in this very, cloistered, secluded bubble. We called it the Liberty bubble. And there, when I was meeting with Dane, and he was constantly, cheering me on, saying, you can do it. Like you're on the right path. Just give it more time, and eventually you'll find, attraction to this, unicorn of a woman. And that never happened. And when I left, I went to grad school in Ontario at McMaster University, just outside of Toronto, about an hour away from Toronto. And it was there that I started to really realize, no, things aren't changing. And within the evangelical imagination, of course, emphasis on imagination, God is perfect. right? God is perfect. God is, the giver of all good gifts. And God wants me, again, according to, this way of this theology, to change. God wants me to be straight. God wants me to pursue holiness. And holiness, of course, necessitates heterosexuality or heteronormativity bare minimum. And when I realized I wasn't changing, I thought to myself, okay, if God's perfect, and God wants me to change and I'm not changing. The problem's not God. The problem, of course, is me. And when you see yourself
Mm.
as a problem, of course, that's a problem. And so that guilt that I would feel in the past, where I'd be like, okay, I've done something wrong, slap on the wrist, that's one discrete individual action I've done if I looked at porn or masturbated or whatever it was, that's bad. But when I realized that again, I was made to believe I was the problem, that wasn't just guilt where I was feeling guilty about that discrete individual action. It was instead that negative energy I felt towards those actions turned inwards. And it was a reflection of myself. At least that's how I saw it. And
Ugh.
I thought, well, I am bad. Not that I've done something bad in this moment, but I myself as a person am bad. And that's when that shame really then turned into a lot of self-hatred, then, snowballed from there. So for me, that's why I do think of the violence of conversion therapy really predominantly being that which came after
Mhm.
the sort of weeks and the months and the years after. There was, of course, a lot of messed up BS going on in the moment. But if I am to think like where would I sort of like what would I say is really the big wound of conversion therapy? And I think that for me was the aftermath of realizing that things weren't changing, and again with that realization came this really, negative self-estimation, which again compounded over the years until I had to really actively work against that understanding of self.
I'm just so sorry that happened to you. I'm so sorry when this happens to anybody because like you're saying, I think it does really create lasting harm. And I think, the work that you're doing and the research and the books that you're putting out there, I think are going to, help with some of the shame that I think a lot of people end up incorporating into who they are as humans. I'm wondering, a lot of the work that I do with gay men, I do a lot of relationship work. And so whether it's like a relationship intensive or, whatever it may be, we're really working on a lot of it is like the relationship with someone's self, right? And so what you're describing is the relationship to yourself getting pretty warped in a lot of different ways. Is that what you're seeing in the research that you're uncovering or the stories that you're hearing? Are you seeing, what are you seeing?
Yeah, so if we are to look at, more recent research about conversion practices and the consequences or effects of conversion practices, the number one cited consequence of conversion therapy by survivors themselves, and this is coming from a recent Canadian study, is shame. And from there, there's a lot of other, again, consequences we can talk about, like we said already, guilt or anxiety, suicidal ideation, depression, strained relationships with self, strained relationships with queer community, strained relationships with romantic partners and beyond, right? There's a lot more than that. But those are some of the bigger issues. But I think that with survivors, I can think of again those who have undergone conversion therapy and those who have undergone conversion practices. And what I say now, and I'll separate those two out in a second, is that although not every single queer person has undergone conversion therapy, every single queer person has experienced conversion practices. Now, the question, of course,
Wow.
is what are these two different things? Conversion therapy, I think, again, it's this very intentional, specific experience or space that a lot of people go through. And again, there's a lot of variety within that umbrella or under that umbrella. Where someone can have a conversion therapist, one can be one's own conversion therapist. One's conversion therapist can be a pastor, a counselor, a parent, whomever. But again, that's there are certain sort of characteristics that I think define conversion therapy. And again, if there's really over a sustained period of time. Now, conversion practices are broader. Conversion practices are everything from again conversion therapy or just that messaging that accumulates over time, right? So when you're a kid, you're a young boy and you're I don't know sitting a certain way and your dad says don't sit like a sissy, or a young girl, she's playing with the truck and her mom takes the truck and gives her a doll instead, right? Saying you're not going to play with this, that's what boys play with, right? There's this messaging that accumulates over time. There's also bullying and physical and spiritual and emotional and beyond consequences or sort of actions But I do think that it's really this accumulation of messaging over time that really is aiming to change an individual or individuals to align with the heteronormative model, right? So although not everyone was in, a space that can be defined as conversion therapy, again, every single queer person has in some way, shape, or form heard messaging, been told or to do certain things or not do certain things. And these are, again, messages or actions that are pushing this individual to really act like a straight person or act like, a cis, presentation of gender. And so I think that, and if we are to expand even beyond that, we can even say that there are a number of straight people whose gender identity or expression does not align with the heteronormative model. And even for them, there's,
Mhm.
again, they've experienced conversion practices, not to make it so that like everyone feels included, because that's not my goal. But, I think there is something to be said, and there's an argument to be made that, again, every single queer person has undergone this, and whether it's in a religious context or not, even though conversion practices happen disproportionately, or conversion therapy, I should say more specifically, happen disproportionately within religious communities. Again, it's not something that's confined to the church or to the synagogue or any religious, one religious community. There is diffuse societal homophobia and transphobia and heterosexism that affects so many folks that is, again, not just within ecclesial or religious context, but beyond. So again, I think this is what, when we're talking about conversion therapy, these are, and conversion practices more broadly, it affects a lot more people than we think. But again, perhaps we just haven't really thought about it in those terms. But I think that when we do think about it in those terms, we can understand our experiences a little bit better.
I think that's a really powerful way that you're putting it. The conversion practices that so many of us as queer folks have encountered in one way or another. In terms of you can answer this personally or from your research or the stories that you're reading, but how do you think this impacts people as they're building relationships with other partners in the future?
Not well. That's understood. Well, I think that, again, like if we're thinking specifically in the context of a religious community, right away, again, you're not, most of the time, one's conversion therapist is someone who's in a position of authority, someone who's trusted. That right away, when someone leaves a religious community, or maybe even if they stay in, they are going to have, a difficulty or a struggle with trusting authority from that point forward, whether it be religious or not. So that's, I think, first and foremost. Also, when you think about a lot of these folks who are in positions of authority, they are people who are respected or honored within these communities. And then later on, one realizes the violence of what this person did. That also, creates a lot of trust issues, right?
Hmm.
That you think, well, here was someone who I was told had my best interests in mind, who clearly was not a good faith actor, or even if they were a good faith actor in the sense that they really did believe this was good and this was, going to help them. It doesn't matter, right? Like intentions don't always matter. In fact, oftentimes they don't really matter. What matters is the consequence of how people have acted, whether or not they again were bad faith or otherwise, or good faith, should I say? So I think that there's again a lot of issues with authority. There's a lot of issues with trust. I think on top of that, with the shame that we're talking about, that is both what brings people into conversion therapy and also is the number one consequence of conversion therapy. That affects, of course, a lot of intimate relationships, right?
Hmm.
Where you don't see yourself as worthy, you don't see yourself as good, you see yourself as dirty, as defective. And if anyone tries to love you, well, you're in a lot of senses are questioning that love. How could someone love me like that, right? How could someone love, this disgusting disaster of a human who doesn't deserve love? So I think that those are, the first things that come to mind. And there probably is, a number more, many more consequences. But those are the things that I think really stand out, and that's what you see in the research. That's what you see in the literature. And again, it takes years to undo a lot of this, and a lot of actual therapy. And one shouldn't have to go to therapy after going to quote unquote therapy, right? But
No.
this is what we're talking about when we're talking about conversion therapy. Again, a misnomer. But this is, these are some of the death dealing consequences that people have to sort of navigate post conversion therapy.
Hmm. I mean, that's a beautiful segue into. I wanted to read just a little bit from your chapter in the book, if that's okay. So
Yeah.
this is after you talk about your interaction with Mac, where you're both kind of sexually exploring over Skype, and then Mac continued, "Luke, do you remember when you said you wanted to hold my hand?" "Yes, sir," I replied. I haven't stopped thinking about it since. My stomach dropped. I want to know how your fingers feel around mine, he said, before pausing again. Take a deep breath in, and then he continued. I want to know how big your hands are. If they're warm, or if they're cold, I'd warm them up for you. If they were, I've never held hands with someone I actually want to hold hands with, and I just want to hold hands with you. I mean, this gutted me reading this because, so many of us in the queer community, we have this second queer adolescence, or we don't, our adolescence doesn't usually line up with where our physical adolescence happens. And it's a period of exploration and, a really beautiful period of time. And this was a moment where the two of you could have had that experience together, but it was clouded by, the environment that you were in. I'm wondering what your reaction is to just hearing me read this to you right now.
You know what? That line, even right now, and it brings like, what's the word? I choke a little bit. And even when I wrote it, I mean, it's funny. I mean, the rest of the story makes clear where Mac is today, and I don't, maybe I won't ruin it. But writing that in the moment, and then thinking about it since, reading it since, and also now hearing you read it aloud, it always makes me a little bit choked up, because I think that Mac um, is absolutely a victim, is absolutely someone who was taken advantage of, someone who was manipulated and controlled into doing what he ultimately did. But in this moment, he wasn't in the situation that he is in today. Again, the story makes clear where he is today, but it's just an absolute missed opportunity, right? It's an absolute, missed really life. I think about, I have a number of friends who went through conversion therapy, from Liberty specifically and beyond. But when I think about those who went to Liberty, I have a few friends. I'm thinking of my one friend, Michael, who was the first friend I ever came out to when I was at Liberty. Maybe even, no, he wasn't the first person I ever came out to. The first person I came out to was on MySpace. But we put that aside. But Michael in person, the first person I ever came out to in person was my friend Michael. And he and I, when we came out to each other, he asked me, he said, Luke, have you ever been attracted to a woman? And I said, yeah, I'm bisexual. And in the office where there's like the confessional, Mindy Kaling, she says at one point to Ryan, she goes, I'm pregnant. And then in the confessional, she goes, like, just shakes her head. No. That was me. I'm bisexual. I'm actually not. But and so I said I was bisexual again, complete lie. Or I guess a half lie, I should say. Anyway, and then Michael said, I said to Michael, have you ever been attracted to a woman? He said, no. Well, fast forward 5 years, 6 years, Michael got married. Michael then had kids, and he got married to a woman, and again had kids. But eventually he got a divorce. Is on good terms with his ex-wife, but is now living that big old gay lifestyle he was warned about when we were at Liberty. But I just think to myself, there are so many folks out there who don't get out of those situations, who stay in those situations. And the fact that they're even in those situations in the first place, is heartbreaking. And I think that, there's so many reasons why people stay within these religious communities, and oftentimes it's fear, oftentimes it's shame, and again, maybe the list goes on when it comes to these emotional attachments to the faith community in which people find themselves. But regardless, it is heart-wrenching to see so many people live inauthentic, lives. And it's not uncommon, right? It's not exceptional in the literal sense of the word. There are so many people I know, and even if you look on TikTok, you look on Instagram, and you have all these, ex-gay influencers, or these folks who say, I am attracted to men, but I'm going to live a celibate lifestyle. And they're talking to, they show them like themselves like dancing, like, we love Jesus, it doesn't matter. And then there's the next video where they're like sitting there like crying on camera saying it's so difficult. And you're like, you're living in a prison of your own making, or at least a communal making, right? However, these are victims, right? These are people who have been, effed over by their religious communities for years, and their families, also part of their religious communities. And it's heartbreaking. I think that, and I've oftentimes had people ask me, like, how do you, like, do you wish that, like, what could you do or go back to yourself when you were like 15 or 16? What would you say to yourself? And I'm like, it doesn't matter what I would say to myself, because to be honest, I wouldn't have listened. And I think a lot of these folks really won't listen, because this religious system in which they find themselves is so all encompassing, and it's such a totalizing system that there really is no, in their mind, in their theological imagination, alternative to doing what they're doing, right? They cannot live this big gay lifestyle because, again, that's a one-way ticket to hell. And it's just this really insidious system that needs to be, identified for what it is, which is, again, insidious. And I have no problem saying that as a person who researches religion. People oftentimes say, like, what do you think about religion? And I'm like, well, I mean, sure, there are fine faith traditions out there. But does that mean that we need a faith tradition to live well and to be good folks? No. And I think that more often than not, and what we're seeing is this like tide of right-wing extremism today. Religion, again, it can be a force for good, but so often it is a force for evil.
Oh my goodness. I can't tell you how many clients I have worked with over the years who have experienced some form of religious trauma in this way. And it's devastating, and it takes a long time to kind of work through that. In terms of, I think you're spot on that somebody who is not yet open to the idea that they may be, queer, gay, whatever their identity may be, they're not going to be open to hearing any kind of advice. But if somebody was watching this video and they're kind of in that contemplative moment and they're open to it, what advice would you give somebody right now?
I mean, I guess if there is that contemplation, um, I think, I mean, maybe I'll start with my own sort of experience and
Uh-huh.
then zoom out. I just think to myself, like for me, I left Liberty, went to McMaster, and I remember I went down to Albuquerque, New Mexico for a conference. It was my first conference, and I thought it was so cool. My work was terrible that I was presenting, but I thought, I'm changing the world with my research on Anzia. So I get down to Albuquerque, and I thought to myself, I'm now in a place where no one knows me. I can do whatever the heck I want. And I was in my hotel room, or actually, I was on my way to a hotel room, and I said to the taxi driver, "This is before Uber." Well, it actually probably wasn't before Uber. I just didn't know what Uber was. I'm always like 10 years behind technologically. So I said, "Stop at the gas station." So we stopped at the gas station. We got two things. We got a six-pack of Blue Moon, and then a can of dip. I used to dip when, anyway, it's disgusting, but that's what I. So did go back to my hotel. I drank a few beers, and I got up with enough courage, and I said, "Okay, I'm going to go to this gay bar." And so I remember I went to this gay bar, and it was my first. Was it my first gay bar? That I don't know it, but what I will say is that it was my first gay bar by myself because I went to another gay bar as a straight person with my cousin, but that's a totally other story. And so I get to this gay bar, and I was waiting in line, and this group of guys were ahead of me, and I only brought cash because my debit card wouldn't work at the time in the US because it was a Canadian debit card, and I tapped the guy in front of me on the shoulder, and I said, "Hey, how much does it cost to get in?" And he said $20. And I was like, well, gee whiz, I only brought 40. And so they were like, well, where are you from? You've never been here? I said, no, I'm from Canada. And they were like, oh my gosh, a Canadian. What are you doing in Albuquerque? So anyway, talk, talk, talk. Anyway, that night at the gay bar was my first moment of just being able to be myself that I really ever had. And it was my first time where I could just let go and sort of, again, I was anonymous and it didn't really matter who I was, and no one around me was going to tell on me or tell my, church or whatever. And that for me was this unbelievably freeing moment that it was really like a bug in my ear from that point forward that over time I couldn't stop thinking about that experience of going to a gay bar, dancing, meeting a bunch of gay guys who were just openly gay and doing their thing. And so for me, that really set me in motion to allow my lived experience to determine my theory. Because up until that point, all of my theory or my theology, and of course, at the end of the day, theology is just theory about God and the situations under the gospel, blah blah blah, at least in the Christian context. And up until that point, my theory really guided how I lived. So I put my theory first, where I said, okay, I believe that Jesus is X, Y, and Z. Therefore, I'm going to act in this way. But I decided when I moved to Nashville, not long after I went to Albuquerque and allowed my lived experience to determine my theory, I said, I'm going to allow myself just to live and be. And then after I do that for however long it takes, maybe a year, I'm going to then perhaps reevaluate. Maybe I'll go back to where I switched to, theory first and lived experience second. But at first, for now, I'm going to see if my lived experience can really determine my theory and again, see how it shapes it. And so I did. And over time, that was my ticket out. I mean, I was also in grad school and I was, learning and reading a lot of different, again, theories, but also I was encountering different texts and different voices and different arguments and whatever about gender and sexuality that really, again, sparked a lot of sort of curiosity that perhaps, again, sort of I kept pulling on the thread and kept going and going to the point where eventually I gave up my faith commitments that I once held because they just did not fit or map onto the world that I lived in. But for anyone who is, again, exploring these things, I think, again, to allow yourself to live first and see how your lived experience shapes your theory. And again, for a lot of people, for a lot of conservative Christians, they'll never do that. This is heresy. But if I am to think of like what's practical, what actually allows people to really come into their own skin and figure out who they are, I think that's a really important thing to do. And again, that of course took me separating myself from my religious community. That took me again separating from myself from the theology that I had held up until that point. But it's almost like for me, it was like a rumspringa. You know what I mean? Like I was able to just like take a period of time and to figure things out and see what I really thought and what I really believed and what I, how again did my lived reality or my lived experience shape what I thought about God. And so I think that it's really two things. Again, separating yourself from religious community for at least a little bit and exploring these things, and also reading voices or reading, texts or work by folks who disagree with you and whose beliefs and worldview is different from yours. These were the two things that really got me out of the system and allowed me really to accept myself for who I am. But again, I'm always sort of cautious to say that, not because I think it's wrong, but because I just think to myself, these folks who are within these high control religious communities simply won't listen to this. They think it's heresy. But again, if there's that moment of exception, that moment where you go out and do your own thing, your rumspringa, whatever it might be, however you want to frame it or, understand it. That's, I think, a way of really coming into yourself and allowing yourself to be as honest with yourself as possible.
Yeah. I mean, again, people have to be ready to change, right? They have to be open to it. If they're not, nothing's going to shift. I could keep talking with you about this forever, but we're running out of time here. So I wanted to just give you the opportunity to share what's coming next for you. What are you working on right now that you're excited about?
So my next edited collection is a collection of stories about queer experiences at Christian colleges, universities, seminaries, and divinity schools. And so I have received all the stories. I've gone through and edited them and worked with authors. I now have a round of edits from my editor and have to sort of work through these. But then once everything is, set, squared away and kosher, I will then resubmit, and then hopefully within, I don't know, a year, it'll eventually be published. The publishing game is, incredibly slow, so you have to
Yeah.
sort of just, but which I'm not. I'm like the least patient person ever, and so there's that. But this is what I'm working on right now. Working on, I think the collection. Well, I'm hoping the collection keeps the title that I've recently changed it to, and that's "Don't Ask, Tell All." Christian higher ed's anti-LGBTQ regimes. So it's through University of Georgia Press, and it's under contract. And so just again, have to do that editorial work and just work a little bit further. And then once that's all done, send it to the press. Hopefully, get the green light, and we'll go from there.
It's so important. I mean, we have to get these stories out there. Like you said, I can't believe we're still talking about these things in 2025, but it is still very much alive in the queer community. Where can people connect with you if they want to learn more about you?
So I'm on Instagram at Luke Slam Dunk Wilson. Same on Threads at Luke Slam Dunk Wilson. Same on Blue Sky at Luke Slam Dunk Wilson. But I tried to keep it really consistent. And on Twitter, or the artist formerly known as Twitter X, Wilson underscore FW. So I'm also on LinkedIn under Lucas Wilson, on Facebook as Luke Wilson. So I'm, all over. But yeah, you can find me on social media quite easily, I think.
Great. Well, I'll put all that in the show notes. And again, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me about this. I think your stories are hopefully going to be really impactful for a lot of people out there.
Thanks, Tom. It's been a pleasure.